Yavo Ezri, Sa'ena, El Hehari, Me'ai, Yavo Ezri, Ezri, Me'im Adonai,
participating, sharing space every afternoon for weeks and then for months, inviting me to share his passion and subsequently find my own. We were scrupulous and we were tenacious, asking every question and seeking every answer. And there was no compromise. I swear to you that in those late afternoons, the rest of the world dissolved into nothingness. By the time of my mid-December midterms, I was writing A papers, unceasingly and with a comfortable ease. So here's another truth. I no longer needed to sit beside Mr. Brown. I would now find the stillness and know what I needed to know outside of the classroom, sitting beside him. And I would find it in my own solitary space. Lessons learned and well done, Miss Davis. Go forth from the classroom into the land of milk and honey. You have earned your freedom. So you wonder, my friends, was I ever enslaved? Did I not come willingly to the classroom? Did I not find the lessons liberating? Well, if you think so, you're correct. But there's another lesson, and this is the lifelong lesson, and that is believing in, honoring, and respecting one's humanity, my humanity. That is believing in my right to be seen, to be heard, and to claim my voice. Mr. Brown, he was the one who created space and was there for all of my questions. Mr. Brown came with this unspoken respect for my right to ask for another's time, to learn, and to seek my own answers. My teacher, Mr. Brown, he believed in my sovereignty and my self-determination. My teacher believed that I could and would find that nesting place where I would awaken to all of my glorious potential. This was not about a schoolgirl crush. No. This was about giving birth to myself, to my voice, something that I would do again and again in the years to come. Mr. Brown, he was my midwife, believing that I could and would trust what I perceived to be true and give it voice. That's the essence of writing. And that's the essence of living one's humanity. So those late afternoon visits, they receded. And I found my strong resident voice during class times. But on occasion, I would return for those late afternoon visits. And we would discuss anything and nothing at all in particular. And I knew that I was always welcomed. I knew there was the slightest shadow of a smile that belied what I knew was his happiness at seeing me come into the room. But I never again sat at the desk. I stood with a respectful distance, never again crossing the threshold of intimacy that we shared in the fall of 1972. We could talk about anything, and we did, but it was different now. We would no longer share the illumined stillness in quite the same way. I would now share my heart and my mind and my soul with others. I would now find my way to the still light, alone or in the company of others, but never again with my 10th grade honors English teacher. My friends, perhaps I'm not entirely right. You tell me. If his memory lives within my heart, does he not still live in the light? Does he still not illumine the darkness when I'm lost in the shadows? Does his memory not remind me that I am worthy and that I am duty-bound to love, honor, and obey? Love self, honor self, and obey all that I know to be true. I never forgot the beard. And I will always remember Mr. Brown. You don't forget someone who fearlessly and without pretense invites you to learn and who always shows up. You don't forget someone who honors your very personal and intimate epic odyssey. You don't forget someone who protects your journey, knowing that learning is a sacred prayer. You don't forget, and you always love. Sir, you taught me well, and I love you, forever sharing the light with you. Hineni.
Whew, goodness. As an English teacher myself, I can't imagine a more beautiful compliment. Thank you, Rana. Up next is David, and he will be performing his story and then also reading Gary Rodbell's, who could not be here tonight.
This is a story of healing. Actually, it's more of a story of breaking. So 2 years ago, my mom died suddenly of a stroke. Her health had been in decline for several years due to diabetes, skin cancer, and a range of other issues. She was blind and managing her health through medications, but she was stable. When she died, there was no warning. No multiple days spent in the hospital to pad the inevitable emotions of loss. She was here 1 minute and gone the next. And I mean this literally. My sister spoke to her at noon. When my dad came home from work at 5, he found her unconscious on the kitchen floor. Her death taught me a lot of things about expectations. I didn't expect her to die. Totally wrong about that. I expected several more years with her. Wrong again. I would never expected her to reach out from the afterlife and help me grieve her death. I was wrong there too. So she died on a Thursday, and the following Saturday we had a celebration of life at my older sister's house. It was a party that Mom would have loved, complete with music, food, lots of drinks, laughing, crying, and reminiscing. I was close with my mom and talked to her often. In my adult years, I confessed things to her about my childhood that she didn't know. Things like my preteen shoplifting stint, and the parties I threw in high school when she and my dad were out of town. And she, in turn, shared lots of her stories from her teenage and college years that were oddly similar. Secrets that she kept from her parents about parties when they were gone. We had quite the bonding experience. We laughed until we cried at some of the things that we shared. However, there was one thing we did not share. I say share in common, and that was any kind of love for Eazy-E. Now, for those of you who might not know or have had the pleasure of knowing who Eazy-E is, I'll give you a brief introduction. He was a 1980s gangster rapper who was among the pioneers of rap music. He gave the world some of the coolest, most bass-thumping, cuss-word-filled, in-your-face songs that all mothers loved to hate. And my mother was no exception. She hated Eazy-E's music. I was only allowed to listen to it through my headphones, which I gladly did because it meant that I would avoid her eye rolls, or head shakes, or lectures about how terrible that music is. Now, I say that, but my mom did love most music. Her taste included everything from pop to country, of course, just not rap. But after she lost her sight, one of her most common and favorite hobbies was sitting outside and listening to playlists. One of her favorites was made during a girls-only weekend. So naturally, it was the first set of music we played for her celebration. I could see her singing along to Jimmy Buffett and the Dixie Chicks and Queen as they blared through the speakers. It was comforting to hear what she had listened to. Also made it a little bit more hard to believe that she was gone. Now, I was doing okay, mingling with family, people I hadn't seen in a while, repeating the same lines. I know, it's so hard to believe she's gone, yada, yada. We made it to the hospital 2 hours before she died, yada, yada. And then I heard it. I was talking with my nephew when I heard the unmistakable beat to Eazy-E's song, Boys in the Hood, playing through the speakers. I froze. This was out of character for Mom. And I wasn't sure who chose the music. So I asked my nephew if he had put on some music from his own library. His response? I didn't choose this. This is from Mimi's playlist from her girls' weekend. Now, 12-year-old me felt betrayed and shocked. How dare she just up and decide to change her mind about the music she liked? On the other hand, 42-year-old me could only smile and cry in that shake my head out, laugh out loud sort of way. Because all this time, I thought we were sharing our deepest and darkest secrets, only to find out that she had reached back in time and finally come around to the rap music that I remember her hating oh so very much. Or maybe it was me that she was remembering. Eazy-E had died in the 90s. roughly 30 years later, my mother died. If anyone would have asked me what it would take for me to realize my mom was dead, I would have never, in a million years, ever guessed that it would be this moment. But somewhere beyond the grave, my mom and Eazy-E joined forces in a short counseling session with me. Now, as it is, I was barely holding myself together. With each bass line and cuss word, my seams slowly came apart. And for roughly 6 minutes of hardcore rap, every emotion in my body got together and decided to come out of my eyes. It was the type of emotional event that made me question whether I was laughing or crying. It left me exhausted because I could hardly catch my breath in between sobs. I was officially broken. Now, I'm well aware from past experiences that my own healing won't occur until I reach my breaking point. And my mom must have known that as well. And in that cosmic moment, she reached out to me and said, "It's going to be okay. I'm gone, but we still have a lot to share." So I still build playlists full of songs that I like, that maybe Mom liked, maybe she didn't. I do put on songs that I know she did like. Etta James, the Pointer Sisters, Alanis Morissette, and now occasionally Eazy-E. And when my mom was alive, she taught me to find the humor in a bad situation. It's only fitting that her lesson still continues in death. Because when I needed her most, she sent Eazy-E to make me cry. And scene. Okay. Thank you. This is a story that Gary Rodbell wrote, and I will be reading it on his behalf. October 9th, 1973. I sat at lunch with my father. He was a World War II veteran and POW in Nazi Germany. "Gary, if Israel loses this war, Judaism as we know it will cease to exist." That was the first time I saw him cry. I felt compelled to do something. Anything. March 1978. I'd been a soldier in the Golani Brigade. This is a prestigious combat unit that I volunteered for when beginning my service. I had been a member of the Golani Brigade for over 1 year and was headed home to visit my family. The Israeli Defense Forces, upon my departure, had given me specific instructions on what to do given any military emergency in Israel. I had been back for only a few days when during breakfast my mother turned on the TV. "Gary, come take a look at what's happening in Israel." News bulletins were on all the major networks. Terrorists belonging to the Palestinian Liberation Organization had landed north of Tel Aviv and hijacked a bus filled with Israelis, mostly children, resulting in a terrible loss of innocent lives. Incredible as it was, I watched as the situation unfolded and knew I needed to connect with the Israeli consulate. I called a designated phone number and confirmed that I was an Israeli soldier in the Golani on a home visit in New York, but on active duty. I was told that I should return immediately and that there was space for me on an El Al flight that evening. My parents were in shock as I had just returned home and was leaving suddenly because of this attack. I called my father at work and told him. His response was quick. "You're not going back. It's far too dangerous." My answer was simple. "There's no choice. I'm leaving this evening." He didn't come home that evening, and my mother drove me on a lonely, rainy night to JFK. We barely spoke, and when she dropped me off, I saw she was crying. "It'll be all right, Mom. This is what we trained for, and I'll be back again soon." In less than 36 hours, I was back in Israel. I hitchhiked my way up north, stopped to get my uniform and weapon, and arrived that evening in Kiryat Shmona, near the Lebanon border. There was a lot of military activity, and I learned my unit had already crossed into Lebanon, and I needed to wait until morning to find out how I could reunite with them. "You can sleep in one of our tents," said one of the artillery officers, "and tomorrow morning you should be able to reach your unit." Not much sleep was had with intermittent artillery fire most of the night. Earlier the following morning, I was on my way into Lebanon. Another country, no passport required. We reached my platoon before lunch. How surprised and also elated they were to see me. I sensed another feeling of unspoken bond which soldiers sometimes feel toward each other. "Gary, why'd you come back?" as they laughed. "It never occurred to me not to," I answered. "These were my brothers, and whatever was going to happen would happen to us all." I laughed as well. Time passes slowly in a war zone, and the level of anxiety ebbs and flows. Throughout the day, and always peaks at night, with each side trying to surprise the other and capture more territory. We were preparing for a nightly ambush after an early meal. I walked down a hill in front of our armored personnel carrier when suddenly, about 200 yards in front of me, I saw a flash of light. A rocket-propelled grenade heading right at me. We were under attack. The ground beneath my feet exploded where the RPG hit, and I was thrown forward into a ravine. All around me, I heard bullets flying into the high grass, a sound I will never forget. My back against an embankment, I held my weapon close. "So this is how things end," was my first thought. I waited for the terrorists to advance, and then thought, if they do, I will not go down alone. By this time, my entire unit was returning fire, and the sky lit up as if it were day. Then I realized if I returned fire from my position, I could be mistaken for the enemy. I stayed very quiet. Minutes were an eternity, as finally the firing died down. I knew they would start counting soldiers behind me for wounded or missing, just a matter of time before they knew I was not accounted for. Far from being safe, I waited. With training comes solutions, and the IDF protects their own. It was a short time, and they realized through a quick head count that I had become separated during the firefight. Officers initiated a series of sounds and lights, which I was able to respond to, and they quickly found me. With an eye on where the terrorists had been and watching for IDF soldiers, I was able to climb back to our position and reunite. So much had happened in such a short time, maybe 15 minutes, but I survived. We remained in Lebanon for quite some time, and in the next year, made many repeat visits. About 2 weeks after the incident, an officer approached me and told me in the light of what had happened, the Golani Brigade was asking me to partake at the annual Independence Day ceremony in Jerusalem. This was the 30th anniversary of statehood, and marching in the Golani Brigade's honor guard, carrying the battalion flag, was beyond my imagination. At 19 years old, it's hard to put these kinds of things into their proper perspective. However, at that moment, it occurred to me that I, as a Jewish American, was representing so many Golani soldiers that had never returned home. This is where my story ends, but the Golani Brigade lives on, defending our homeland, as we all know too well that freedom is not free.
Thank you, David and Gary. Thank you, David, for a beautiful tribute to my mother-in-law, and Gary for a wonderful story to give us an insight into the Israeli war. And I would like to just commend you both. The veteran representing veteran is very special. Up next, we have Roberta.
Wow. Thank you, David. Powerful to follow. This story won't make you cry or feel like saluting the men who serve us, but I'll tell it. It's special to me. Rosella, Rosella, Rosella. Stargazer, grapefruit juice drinking witch. It was 1972, and I was an 18-year-old version of myself. My college time in Bellingham, Washington. I was across the continent from my hometown, and I was hungry for learning. Biology, Greek, astronomy, and astrology. I saw Rosella's flyer with the phone number tabs on one of the campus bulletin boards, the social media of our time. Astrology, she was teaching astrology. I'd read some books on the subject in my hometown library. I wanted to learn more. I was fantasizing. I made the call, and we arranged to meet near her home, not too far from campus. My eyes widened when I first saw Rosella. 65 years old, maybe 5 foot tall, and half as wide. She wore an old gray wool coat and a flowered babushka tied under her chin. We exchanged personal information and decided I would come to her home for a one-on-one astrology class. Her lessons were exciting and filled with teachings of the ancient science of the stars. Her teaching was colorful. Orion the hunter with his faithful dog companion chasing the bull Taurus who chased the 7 sisters in the night sky. Rosella vibrantly brought the stories of the constellations to life. Actually, she came to life vibrantly. My excitement crossed over to the conversations with friends and classmates, and soon we had a small group taking her astrology classes. We soaked up the teaching of the signs, Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, the fire signs, and all the others. We learned about the powerful influences of the planets and how to cast or create a chart. Yet, we were equally enthralled by the stories she told us of her younger years. She'd been a jazz singer in a big band during the 1930s. She reminisced. She'd been talented, a sultry and soulful musician and singer. She had been fun. She glowed as she described these times in her past life. I was invited to come and live with her, and I moved into our small home with a tiny, sunny kitchen. That's where she taught me to squeeze a fresh grapefruit, actually, a half of a fresh grapefruit every morning. The first sip, drink full potency. Savor the sweet and sour taste, liquid sunshine. Then add water, enough for a small glass to stretch it, and drink for good health and longevity. She shared her poetry about the mysteries of life, personal and transcendental. 6 months was all the time we had together. I took the train home across the country. She would stay in Bellingham another year before she headed back to her hometown of Punxsutawney, PA. We wrote letters to each other. I kept Rosella's letters. They were full of love and wishes for good health and happiness. And she had the most unusual spiky little letters in her handwriting. Could be that's where my love affair with words and letters started. She wrote letters, I received letters. And I remember she got sick and the letter stopped. No family or friends wrote. Perhaps they didn't know about me. And nearly 5 decades later, I think of Rosella. My heart warms at her memory and those life lessons she taught me. My first 18-year-old realization that a frumpy, older-looking woman could be an exciting teacher with wisdom to share, that she was once young and beautiful, a singer, a musician, that we all carry our younger selves within our older selves. I learned that life's relationships are both fragile as a spider's web and strong as steel. Our time together was brief, yet there was lasting impact and lifelong lessons. I know now that resurrected memories can tie together the pieces of one's current heart and soul. And I know most certainly that hand-squeezed grape juice is indeed liquid sunshine.
Thank you so much, Roberta. It did not make me want to salute you, but I want to have some grapefruit juice and hear all about her because she sounds absolutely amazing. And that was wonderful. Thank you. Up next is Sabrina.
Buncombe County Public Records of Birth, Marriage, and Death. My laptop's blinking cursor on the web page provided the light in my dark living room on that cold, late December night. My law partner was dying, and earlier that week, I'd started looking at old files she'd closed, pondering all of the meaningless places we leave our names. That's when I'd seen the last name on a real estate transaction she'd closed over 20 years ago, Young. This name left behind was far from meaningless. The paperwork listed him as deceased. It said a death certificate was attached, but it wasn't. Now, trying to look up the death certificate, I realized I didn't even know the exact street address. I did know the road, though. Witch Hazel Way was a gravel, winding, dusty road about 25 miles and a life away from the shabby one-story ranch where I'd grown up. My heart would beat faster in my chest as I turned off the air conditioning so my first tiny blue car could make the climb. The roof of the 3-story brown house would peek through the treetops, and every Friday afternoon, I'd lug my big black guitar case out of my little trunk and walk through the basement door with the small sign that read, Jerry Young Guitar Studio. Immediately, the smell would hit you. If you've never stuck your nose inside the hole of a guitar and breathed in, do it the first chance you get. Guitars smell like fresh wood and warm caramel, sweet, salty, earthy. The Jerry Young Guitar Studio smelled like you'd walked into a guitar. Most Friday afternoons, I'd tune my bargain-priced nickel steel-stringed guitar while I made excuses about why I hadn't practiced, always having to do with too much homework. He'd tell me my homework was more important anyway, and then he'd segue into quizzing me about the national news. Before long, the 30-minute lesson my parents had paid for had turned into 45 minutes or an hour, and he'd suppose we'd better play some more so my parents would get their money's worth. He'd pick up his big jazz guitar and play rhythm, while I'd play the melody of a few classics I'd never heard before in a home that only listened to gospel and country music. Then he'd start stroking his auburn graying beard with his long fingers, and we would be talking again about what exactly was I going to do with my life. And the phone would ring because my parents were worried I wasn't home yet. At 16, my guitar lesson was one of the few places I got to drive alone. He'd assure my parents that I was just leaving as he'd wink and nod to my case to indicate I'd best not make a liar out of him. I'd started taking guitar lessons from Jerry Young because my younger brother had given up and my parents had already paid. In that small studio, I'd quickly moved from taking guitar lessons to taking life lessons. My parents just didn't know it. Mr. Young, as I always called him, had grown up poor and seen the Navy as his way out. He'd traveled the world as part of a naval band and then had obtained a degree in literature. Mr. Young always smelled like he'd just brushed his teeth. He loved to fly fish, worried about the environment before climate change was in the nightly news, and believed I could be president. At least one segment of our lesson would begin with him rubbing his balding head absent-mindedly and saying, "I've been thinking this week, Sabrina, when you are president, you really need to focus on," and then he'd explain something usually related to greenhouse gases or carbon emissions or corporate greed. The summer before I left for college, nearly every week I'd cry as the dust followed me back down Witch Hazel Way. As happy as I was to be leaving a lot behind me, I knew how much I was going to miss Mr. Young. True to his word, however, he called and wrote me in his beautiful flourished script often through my undergraduate years. I count one of his phone calls among the most important in my life. My very first assignment at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill was a political science essay that I had to turn in to a cocky graduate student. I got a C. I had never gotten a C on a paper in my entire life. I could feel the hot tears of shame and disappointment welling up as I entered my dorm room that evening. What the hell was I thinking? The first person in my family to go to college, thinking just because I got good grades at a rural high school I belonged here? I was debating how I could tactfully extricate myself from the entire situation, knowing how pleased my parents would be to come get me when I admitted they were right and I had no business here, when Mr. Young called. He convinced me to drop the class as soon as he heard about the cocky graduate student, and he made me promise I would stay. I did both. Every time I came home from college, my first call was to schedule my visit with Mr. Young. He saw me through an engagement, a called-off wedding, graduation, a full scholarship to law school, and he met the man who would become my husband, a music man himself. In fact, the same weekend I introduced my husband to my parents, he also met Mr. Young. In December of my second year of law school, my mother came to Chapel Hill to visit. After dinner, she said, "I need to tell you that I heard Jerry Young died. The rumor is he killed himself. I couldn't find an obituary." I looked in the newspaper too. I called his number. It was disconnected. Over the years, I've Googled him repeatedly, even driven up Witch Hazel Way to see if somewhere there might be some marker. I've told myself how rumors get started. He probably had a mundane death, like a heart attack or a stroke. Yet it had never occurred to me to look up his death certificate until now. I found it that December evening, and it read, "Cause of death, single gunshot wound to the head, self-inflicted." There it was, in black and white. The person who taught me the most about life chose to end his. I'm still left pondering how someone who taught me so much about how to live could choose so emphatically to die. I'm learning how to make peace with the fact I'll never be able to answer that question. But I can make sure that this beautiful man with no children, no grave, no obituary, is not forgotten. I say his name every chance I get. I suppose that's why I chose to tell you this story. So now his name will mean something to you too.
Thank you, Sabrina. The power of speaking a name, and we will speak it now as well. Thank you. Up next is Ahava.
on June 10th, 2020, after 2 months of unemployment, stacked on top of running out of things to do during a pandemic, the emptiness was amplified. I've been alone most of my life. My father died when I was young, and my mother had to work most days to pay the bills. I wasn't really raised with a sense of togetherness. Family was less of a responsibility to people who loved you so much as it was an obligation to people who you were related to by blood. This absence of human connection has laid the foundation for a deep loneliness that has only begun to heal in the last 4 years. I tried to reach out on Facebook, writing, "I'm tired of being on the verge of snapping or giving up." Most of the responses missed the mark. Go dance in the rain. Go create something. Call me if you need me. Although they meant well, it felt like slapping duct tape on a breaking dam. One of my friends did seem to grasp the severity of the situation. As a veteran, he understood warning signs and posted the number for a veteran suicide hotline. Unfortunately, because it was a veterans hotline, I just knew I would be on hold for hours. I was starting to consider steps I could take to not have to feel the loneliness and the hopelessness anymore. And then my phone rang. In the eternal moment between when I recognized the name on my caller ID and answering the phone, I remembered all of my angels who had lifted me up out of these moments before. The people who showed up without notice and held me, listened, and gave me better options. But this was different. Those were random people at the right place at the right time. This person was someone who would be deeply impacted by my absence. As one friend mentioned before, after I expressed that I bothered this angel with my depression, that this angel would rather be bothered than attending my funeral. I broke. I could barely say hello between sobs. "What's going on, Ahava?" she asked. I started to tell her exactly how I felt. I didn't want to be here. I didn't know if I could do this anymore. How she responded changed the entire course of my life. "I hear you," she said. "What do you need right now?" No one had ever asked me this before. I started to look around when my eyes stumbled upon a glass of water I happened to have beside me. "Water," I said. "I can do that. I can drink water." It's amazing how something so basic could be an anchor to reality. As I sipped, my angel went on to explain that it was okay that my mind wandered away from me. That was its job. At the same time, I didn't have to believe any of it. She validated my heartbreak while guiding me to the reality that positive things are also happening, and that I'm allowed to let them in. She also went on to tell me that it was my friend who posted the veteran suicide hotline that let her know I needed her. After many moments of her talking and me listening very intently, sipping my life juice, she said, "You can tell me I'm full of it." "No," I said, "you're not, and thank you." After that phone call, any time I'd reach out to her after hitting a similar wall, she always says the same thing. "I hear you." It has been life-changing to have someone acknowledge my grief when I'm in it, instead of trying to steer me away from it because they don't want to feel it. I wish people could see how simple it is to ask someone what they need. I guarantee the answer will most likely not be to die. I didn't want to feel the pain. I needed soothing. I needed connection and to be heard. Understand that this internal battle isn't about you losing them. It's about helping them believe that they can move through their pain, and you are beside them, holding their hand. We need to stop shaming people for not wanting to move through or live in their pain. You saved my life, not just in that moment, and now I can trust someone brave enough to sit with my heartbreak. I will continue to remind you of how deeply appreciated you are and how grateful I am to have you in my life. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for everything.
Oh, goodness. What a beautiful story. The power of I'm here and I hear you can change the world. Oh, thank you, Ava. Thank you for sharing that. I know somebody out there needed to hear it. We are going to transition down to around the piano for Deborah to share her story, who has been amazing and showing up in a wheelchair.
Is that okay? It's on? Testing? Yeah. Oh, it'll come closer. There we go. This is called Muse. I'd never had a muse. The word sounds ancient, or Renaissance, at least. But this was the 21st century, and I was in my 60s, a gray-haired woman, a former folk singer-songwriter, definitely past my prime. I was in a training workshop one afternoon, designed to put participants in touch with a hidden part of themselves. My silenced singing voice grabbed my attention, screaming out, "Why have you abandoned me?" I felt exhilarated and heartbroken. I'd given up my hard-won seat on the music train, and that train was long gone from the station. I had no clue where to find a new ticket, but I couldn't abandon my voice again. It made my skin crawl, but I started telling everyone who asked, even strangers, that I was looking for new people to play music with. It was his wife, actually, who brought us together. Belinda and I were sitting next to each other at a subsequent training workshop, strangers doing the usual casual intro thing. I dutifully referred to having been a folk singer, and she mentioned that her husband was a guitar player between bands. She'd be happy to mention me to him. Next time I saw her, I gave her some old CDs to pass along to her husband. The vulnerability I felt brought me to the point of nausea. I didn't hear back from him. Whatever. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. 6 months later, Jack contacted me. He really liked my songs. He showed up in my living room one Friday afternoon with his old Martin D28 to play some music. There are many ways to fall in love. Jack and I fell into loving my old songs together. I'd sing a song, and he'd start to cry. It was beyond my wildest dreams. It was a bit of a mixed musical marriage. He was an electric, blues, rock and roll kind of dude, and I was all unplugged, ballads, bluegrass, and modal melodies. And he could sing. Our voices worked beautifully together. Singing harmony with someone is an experience like no other. The instrument is inside your body. It's physical and sensual. Your voices go traveling together on a synchronized wave of tonal beauty. It transports you to a bejeweled realm. Luck doesn't begin to describe what it feels like to find someone you really want to sing harmony with. From day one, I was very deliberate about introducing Jack to my husband, Jim, and bonding with Belinda over parenting young adult daughters. We had Jack and Belinda over to dinner. We went out to listen to music together. Jack and I could both read the invisible writing on the walls. The boundaries were mutual and crystal clear. We followed the rules without comment or question. Older age has some advantages. I loved my husband and my marriage, and Jack loved his wife. We'd both been around the block enough times to understand that finding the music together was the real miracle. What might feel like cowardly restraint in one's youth reveals itself later in life as wisdom. And thus, the music blossomed. I was sure I'd lost the ability to write a song. It had been years. But inspiration is the holy wine of creative juices. First, I wrote Clover, and then The Calling, and Hand-Me-Down Love, and Precious Time, and Big Mystery. One song followed another. He met each one with joyful enthusiasm. We started getting little gigs, and then they got bigger, spots at the good local clubs. A dear friend from my long-ago bluegrass days joined us to play bass. His name was Jack. Eventually, I had enough new material for an album. The sound engineer who was producing the record asked to join the band, playing mandolin and dobro. Of course, his name was also Jack. We were a full-fledged band now, Deborah and her band of Jacks. Recording may sound like a blast, and the Jacks were pumped. I'm a perfectionist about lyrics and melody lines. Trying to execute every one of them to unattainable perfection requires endless repetition, and that's before you even walk into the studio. Plus, there's raising money, finding additional backup musicians, and herding the millions of cats into an efficient schedule. Finally, we were ready to start. An old friend flew in for the weekend to play harmonica. Donors who had pledged money in return for the pleasure of hanging out in the control room arrived with us at Wellspring Sound on a Saturday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Everyone, that is, but my main Jack. Lead guitar Jack. Lead harmony vocals Jack, my Jack. He typically ran late, but this was a freaking recording session, not a living room rehearsal. The clock starts ticking the moment you walk into a recording studio. About 20 minutes in, I finally got a text. Jack was at home, waiting for a refrigerator repairman to come and fix a leak. Belinda, who I considered my friend, had left the house for her haircut appointment. A haircut appointment. And then she had errands to run. Belinda had been married to Jack, a professional musician, for 30 years. There was nothing about the meaning of this recording session, which meant the world to her husband as well as me, that Belinda didn't understand. Jack finally arrived at the studio 5 hours late. Every ounce of feminist sisterhood loyalty had drained out of my body by the time he finally got there. I felt hatred for Belinda by then. I began to comprehend what must have been brewing for them under the surface of all of our religiously maintained boundaries. Clearly, my beautiful four-leaf clover had been an invasive weed in the garden of her native habitat. The other musicians were disgusted with Jack. The album got made. It was good enough, not as good as it should have been. We sold copies, continued to perform. We even added a fiddler. Her name was Lucy, the stars having shifted out of alignment. I wrote more songs, enough for a second album that never got made. But the flame dimmed slowly, steadily, after that fateful weekend. And just as my muse had blown into my life, my muse blew out. Another advantage of older age. If we manage to learn to pay attention, our wonder at the gifts we've been given deepens our capacity to bear our sharpest losses. Thank you. And I brought CDs of the album with me because I have 600 of them. And if anybody would like one, I'd love to give you one. So I have lots.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you so much, Deborah. I think we can all agree that we would like to hear you sing, and we need a private concert at some time, at some point. Up next, we have Stephanie, and she's going to make her way to the chair.
Stephanie Fisher. I looked around. Who was calling my name in the middle of Central Park? I had just left my office where I was the legal secretary. I had 1 hour for lunch. It was a beautiful May day, and the sun was shining brightly. The trees in Central Park were in full bloom. Stephanie! There it was again. I looked around, and there she was, waving frantically. Phyllis Cohen, one of my houseplant sisters from Brooklyn College, now known as CUNY, City University of New York, Brooklyn College Division. When we were attending Brooklyn College between 1958 and 1962, there were no sororities. Instead, they were called houseplants, local to the college. We belonged to Gale House. It was 1963, and I hadn't seen Phyllis since graduation in May of 1962. Seeing Phyllis Cohen today was going to change my life forever. We started to renew our friendship. Phyllis, who was a beautiful girl with long, straight, sandy brown hair, light brown eyes to match, full lips, round cheeks, and wide, attractive smile, had introduced me amongst some of her friends to her roommate, Sandra Cohn. She was a pretty young lady with blue piercing eyes and a beautiful smile that warmed the heart. I introduced Phyllis to 3 of my Gale House friends who did not know Phyllis. They were Maddie Lynch, Rose Schwartz, and Beta Fields. My best guy friend was Butch Sternberg, to whom I did not introduce Phyllis. I had a habit of not mingling various groups of friends. Butch was short, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, and though not overweight, he looked a little pudgy. However, he was always dressed immaculately in a suit and tie and looked like a bank executive. He had the nicest smile, and his personality was as gentle as a lamb. We met at Brooklyn College at an evening student council meeting in which we were both very active. It took us a while, and we became very close. I did a lot of dating while in college, but no one special. Butch did not have a girlfriend either, but we both liked going out, and that we did. I probably would have never gone to some of the restaurants and places in New York City if it had not been for my friend Butch. Sometimes he would pick me up in his Uncle Frank's Cadillac or have his uncle's chauffeur stretch limousine, who would take us all over the city. His uncle was the leader of a major AFL-CIO union. A typical evening could be starting off at the Waldorf Astoria for cocktails and then go to a Broadway play. Afterward, we would go to a fine restaurant like the Four Seasons, and if we were still wound up, we'd stop at a late-night club for cordials and coffee. Being chauffeured around, we felt like society. We were society. Phyllis and I continued to know each other better when one day she told me that her roommate was getting married, and she was looking for a new roommate, and was I interested? I thought about it and jumped at the offer, as it was the first chance since graduating college that I could declare my independence. And what an apartment it was. A typical Brooklyn apartment building of those days, a 6-story red brick building in the middle of Flatbush, which was considered a middle-class neighborhood. The apartment had a small bedroom with just enough room to accommodate 2 twin beds, with a night table between the 2 beds. There was one chest of drawers and a small closet, that we both had to share. There was also one window next to the beds and a brown painted fire escape attached to the roof, from the roof to the ground floor. Those days, there was no such thing as air conditioning, and there were no window fans. And our apartment was so hot that I often slept on the fire escape or die of the heat. Oh, our apartment was on the 6th floor of this no elevator building. Anyway, my three friends, Maddie Lynch, Rose Schwartz, and Beta Fields, were planning a trip west and were looking for a fourth person to join them. I had accumulated plenty of time off from work, and this was a dream vacation. We would fly to Los Angeles, rent a car, drive down to San Diego, even go to Tijuana, Mexico, then head back up the coast, spending 2 nights along the coast to Carmel, and then 6 nights in San Francisco, where we almost got kidnapped. I didn't have that in there. Sightseeing all over the place, eventually flying to Las Vegas, and taking a bus to Grand Canyon before returning to Las Vegas for a few nights before returning to New York. Oh, a couple of my boyfriends actually drove from New York to Las Vegas because they couldn't believe I was really taking the trip. The whole memorable trip took 3 weeks, and we had a ball. When I got home, Phyllis told me that while I was gone, she met a guy by the name of Bobby Apagus. I called him Bobby Asparagus. And they had fallen in love. He was a handsome man, dark complected, with pockmarks from acne as a teenager. He had been visiting family from Miami, and Phyllis had decided to move to Miami to be near Bobby. So I thought, I didn't want to be saddled with that Brooklyn apartment, and I didn't want to move back with my parents now that I had been on my own. So impulsively I said, I'll go with you. Moving to Miami with Phyllis Cohn changed my life forever. Sadly, I had to say goodbye to Butch.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that wonderful story and the additions of the kidnapping, which I now need to know about. So for the last year, I've had the pleasure of being pen pals with Stephanie. So there are many, many, many stories that we now have to work on together. But definitely ask her about the apartment, because I think that's my favorite. So this concludes our evening. I have our candle here to blow out. I just want to thank everyone for sharing your stories, sharing your hearts, sharing your vulnerable and impactful and important moments. And I also hope that everyone at home has enjoyed and that you will take the time to leave comments, nice comments, and make sure that they know how important this was for you to listen to and to hear. And if you have any comments that you would like to send to me, you're welcome to, or to Cindy, you're welcome to, and we will make sure to pass those along. So for now, we will say goodbye to the Speakeasy. Thank you.